George Miller est évidemment connu pour les Mad Max, mais après avoir fait un détour avec un film de conte absolument dingue, 3000 ans à t'attendre, il fait une suite à Fury Road avec Furiosa, une saga Mad Max. Il nous raconte comment le film a pris vie, l'impact de l'animation et surtout de son dernier long métrage.
I think you're right in one way, even though, for instance, this story is narrated by the history man, which we see at the beginning of this story.
Yeah.
At the very end of Fury Road, there's a quote before the credits that says, "Where must we go, we who wander the wasteland in search of our better selves?" So we already established the history man. Okay. This film begins, the first character we see is the history man, and bit by bit he becomes the narrator of this story, and very consciously becomes almost the mythologizer of Furiosa. So you're right. It was there in the screenplay that we wrote back in the early 2000s before we were going to do an anime of Furiosa, because we wrote it in order to, as a tool to help us understand what was happening in Fury Road, which is a story that happened so quickly. It happened over 3 days and 2 nights. You didn't have time for the exposition. But I think you're right. Doing 3,000 Years of Longing helped amplify that. When you use the tools of the digital dispensation, which is from the early 90s. I mean, before it was all analog, celluloid. And definitely being able to understand the tools and how they evolve is very key to the filmmaking. That's the thing that's always shifting. I mean, when we shot the first Babe, the reason we shot that film, we made that film with Universal, is that they just finished and not yet released Jurassic Park, which is the first big film that was using digital filmmaking. It used animatronics and digital. There were 63 digital shots in Jurassic Park. That led to the pigs and the dogs talking. So that had a big influence. When we did Happy Feet, the cameraman on the Babe movies, Andrew Lesney, a great cinematographer, shot The Lord of the Rings. On the first one, he came back and showed us the first Gollum doing motion capture. That led to the dancing penguins. I began to understand more and more of the tools, and that led to saying, let's do Fury Road, or this story, another Mad Max story, but using all that technology to do things that we could never do. The cameras were much more agile. We could have more cameras. You could run a camera for 45 minutes before you had to change the spool. And so all of that, plus you could erase harnesses. You could have harnesses and rigs and cranes on the actors and the stuntmen. You couldn't have before. You couldn't erase them from them. Each film definitely informed the technology and the process by which you made the next. The world of this film is real to the extent that nothing defies the laws of physics. There are no flying people. There's no flying vehicles. Everything is rooted to the ground. So in every case, when we look at something, when we try to anticipate where the majority of the audience's eyes is scanning on the screen, you always want to make sure that where they're looking at is real. So if, for instance, if it's a vehicle going into a great dust storm, it's very difficult to create a big dust storm. You have to wait for nature to do it, really, or you can have a lot of wind machines, but it's not very big. But make sure that the vehicle that's driving into it is real, if that makes sense. We intended to do Furiosa first as an anime. That's why we wrote the screenplay. We wrote the screenplay for 2 reasons. First was to use as a tool to inform the making of Fury Road. The second was, it's a good story, let's turn it into an anime. But the film was delayed again. There was no point in doing an anime before we actually shot Fury Road. We shot Fury Road, and by the time that happened, we weren't able to do it as an anime before because the crew we had was no longer available. But we said, let's make it into a live action movie. And here we are, just finished two and a half weeks ago.
Does it mean that you still have other plans for the saga or not yet?
We do, again, depending on what happens to Furiosa. We've written the story of Max in the year before we meet him in Fury Road. He has flashbacks in Fury Road, and that's part of the story that we see. What's so wonderful about Cannes, at the heart of it, is the passion for cinema. Most people will see it on a relatively small screen. So to see it at the Palais with an audience of 2,000 people is very exciting, because that's what we make movies for, to see it in front of big audiences in a dark cinema and really being immersed in a movie.
Konbini!